Okay, so welcome to this latest edition of ABNcast. With me, I am Lee Hayhurst, the editorial director at Aviation Business News. Joining me today, all the way from Dubai, he's sat in his car due to some technical reasons, but that's the wonder of modern technology. We can do these things in all sorts of ways these days. Is Hussein Lookmanjee, and welcome, Hussein. Thanks for joining us today on ABNcast.
My pleasure, Lee. I'm happy to be here.
So look, the reason we're talking to you this week is that you had some big news that came out. I think it was just last week, wasn't it, about the formation of a new player in the international aircraft maintenance sector, DTX Group. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about the formation of DTX Group, the short history of where you got to with DTX. Obviously, we know it came out of the Drayton Aerospace business. So just give us a quick rundown on what DTX is and how it came to be formed.
Surely. So I don't know if there's a short version of this, but I'll try to squeeze it all in. So Drayton Aerospace was kind of an evolution from an earlier company, Flight Parts, which had a very much a China focus and very much on the in-flight supplies, which emerged into the MRO space. That's another podcast story, perhaps. But Drayton Aerospace originally was exclusively China focused. And I had established the company there initially in 2010. And the business kind of grew from there. We established a greenfield landing gear maintenance facility with the goal of supporting the international market, but then ultimately evolving and supporting the domestic market. Prior to COVID, 2018, we started to branch out internationally, and Drayton Aerospace actually was quite successful in that regard. We went into South America with the acquisition of TAP Maintenance Engineering's maintenance facilities in Brazil. We also then branched out into the United States with parts distribution and aircraft dismantling. And although COVID did slow that investment, those new facilities, it did slow that down. Post-COVID, we really saw accelerated growth in those areas, and it played a lot to, I guess, my strengths or the company's strengths, in the sense of we learned a lot from the emerging markets of establishing a greenfield facility in China, and then taking that knowledge coupled with the fact that myself and a lot of the management team are foreigners, are international people that can kind of better integrate, better sort of adapt to the international markets and the international needs. We saw tremendous growth. So in the last couple of years, we have five new maintenance facilities that have essentially emerged from that initial decision to expand internationally. Having had that kind of growth, though, it did put some strains internally, where, as an organization that was initially focused China, that took a massive step internationally, there were people that were sort of resistant to that shift in focus. And that ultimately resulted in kind of the ownership or the shareholders parting ways. Myself being the exclusive foreigner part of the Drayton Group, and all the other shareholders being Chinese. And so we ultimately
it started to make sense for you to divest out of the Drayton Group, which was what's happened here. There's new backers for that group, but you've now formed DTX, which is essentially all the international business that came out of Drayton, essentially.
And I think it does play to sort of the owner's strengths. Myself having kind of the ability to and a network internationally. The balance shareholders being exclusively Chinese, although most of them are private equity and financial focused, naturally they look at the Chinese market as sort of an exciting growth opportunity, and not having a foreign shareholder opens doors for them as well, right? They can expand into maybe the military space and support the domestic market there. They can pursue the capital markets as well, things that they would be limited or would be more challenging to do if I was to stay on as a shareholder there.
Sure. So today's focus is really on the DTX side of things. So as of today, what's in the group? I know you've got expansion plans, so we'll talk about that. But as of today, what do you bring in? What does the group encompass?
So today, DTX covers, we have base maintenance. So we have narrow body, regional narrow body, and wide body base maintenance in South America. We have a full in-house landing gear overhaul facility, which is a brand new facility that we set up in Rio de Janeiro. We have an engine overhaul facility for general aviation and regional aircraft, so covering the Pratt & Whitney Canada PT6 and PW 100 series of engines. And then we also have a component maintenance facility covering everything from IDGs, starters, electrical, hydraulics, pneumatics, etc. Then on top of that, we have a new maintenance facility in the Middle East, which is going to be processing the APUs as well as the engine accessories. There are discussions that we're having right now that probably will get concluded in the next 60 days about taking that maintenance facility in the UAE and expanding it to doing the CFM engines as well.
Okay.
And we're that's something in discussions to be confirmed, but that's sort of the direction where that facility is heading as well.
So quite a broad range, quite a broad range of services for the industry then, and I know you've got plans to grow that as well. But as of today, when you look at the sector, we know how busy it is because for various reasons, and these reasons are well documented. It's difficult to get new aircraft into out of the OEMs, but so a lot of the older aircraft are still flying out there and being overhauled more regularly. So we know MROs are extremely busy. If anything, they can't keep up with the demand in the industry. So what is it for you as a player in this space that you'll be focusing on? What the value that you bring to the sector?
Well, from my perspective, leading the international piece of this, I was able to see firsthand sort of the migration of maintenance to Asia and to China specifically over the last 20 years.
Yeah.
And I think COVID and some of the recent geopolitical challenges that the world's facing, I think that now more than ever, there's a need to diversify some of that strategy of Asia and specifically China focus to other emerging markets. That's not to say that China is not a good market to still send maintenance to, but for many large airlines, it was their sole source, right, on their wide body fleet. And I think that from my perspective, I still very much am bullish on the emerging markets. I think the value proposition is still very strong, and I think that the world needs more options that have the capacity that China built. And so that's where our focus is.
I guess one of the things that come out of COVID, not just for aviation, but for all business, is supply chain issues and so on. So there's been a lot of back inshoring or bringing the supply chain closer to the end user. Is that a trend in aviation? Obviously, the nature of aviation is the hardware is ultimately movable. It can go wherever to have maintenance carried out. So there's a plus side there. But is there this push to bring things closer to home just to mitigate against potential risk?
I think given how labor intensive some aspects of maintenance are, insourcing or bringing it closer to home is probably still not viable. I don't think the automation and drones, et cetera, are able to kind of bridge that gap. And the problem that aviation has in terms of supply chain is it's difficult to find capacity to support some of these large fleets that exist now, right? So let's say, for example, if United Airlines wants to shift maintenance from China, where they've sort of been exclusively sourcing their wide body maintenance over the last 20 years to a new destination, I mean, they're pushing 1,000 aircraft. Who's got that much hangar space, experienced manpower, certifications required, etc., to support that? And so I think when we look at places like the Middle East or South America, there does need to be some infrastructure built, right? Even if manpower does exist or there is available manpower, the supply chain challenge of transferring that to new markets, new regions, unfortunately is not as quick as, let's say, some of the manufacturing options, supply
Yeah.
chain diversification strategy.
So this does talk to the issue of skills and people, which we know has been one of the great challenges. Particularly, it's one area people don't necessarily see. When I say people, I mean like the consumer out there. When they look at aviation, they often see the front facing, the consumer facing roles, and we know there's been an issue there as well because there's not been enough people in airports and cabin crew and pilots, etc. But actually, one of the big challenges behind the scenes is engineers. So are you saying there is a good pool of potential engineers in emerging markets which the industry really has to tap into, and then build the infrastructure in those markets so that they can then provide the capacity that's required?
100%. When we first stepped into Brazil, TAP Maintenance Engineering Brazil at one point had 3,000 or 4,000 base maintenance technicians, and that facility we acquired in 2019. It had actually closed, and we purchased the assets, and from the assets, then we built up the maintenance organization kind of step by step. But that meant that there was 4,000 available experienced technicians that are all of a sudden unemployed.
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing similar trends, with Air India, for example. Air India Engineering Services Limited, with its divestment from Tata, and Tata now building up its own maintenance capabilities. Air India Engineering Services has 7 locations, a workforce of several thousand people that today doesn't have a base customer to fill their hangars. But the challenge is, airlines are conservative. Our industry is conservative, right? So it's hard to build the credibility to get the customers to buy in and migrate to some of those markets. I think in terms of Brazil, for us, there's been enough domestic opportunities to kind of earn your stripes to bring in sort of the foreign operators. And given that TAP had a long history there, and Varig before that, there is some history there that the operators internationally recognize. But going into places like Egypt, another great example where labor cost is very competitive, got huge facilities. India, another perfect example. There's no success story that can give these operators that kind of sense of confidence that they first need to take that leap of faith.
Yeah, it is a confidence thing. And how do you find, as a business that has to find, train, and retain this staff, this workforce? How do you find that when you're out there? I guess you're competing, particularly for new entrants into aviation. You're competing with lots of other different sectors which offer a very different lifestyle, work-life balance, so on. How do you think the aviation is competing well enough with these other sectors? Is there things it can do better?
Again, I always have to bring an emerging market focus because that's where we really play. We don't have an issue to bring in talent. We don't have a challenge of attracting people to the industry. I think that speaks to kind of the value proposition of emerging markets, where if we need to bring in a training class of 50, 100 people or plus, it's not difficult. There is obviously the learning curve or the time lag required to get those people up to speed, which is kind of the issue that you're investing for that period of time before they can really be productive. But in that sense, we don't face the same types of challenges, I think, that sort of the West is facing in terms of attracting people and retaining people. I think that whenever a foreign company goes into these emerging markets, though, there's always the risk of bringing too much of that foreign culture in terms of management style, and versus finding some type of a healthier hybrid. And the hybrid, the merging of kind of the local versus foreign culture is really, I think, what's critical in retaining the people.
Yeah. So you always make sure there's some sort of local management style wherever you enter, because that's important. Every company needs a culture that is inclusive and supportive.
Yeah, and I think it even goes perhaps a little deeper than that. For example, in China, if you bring a foreign culture in to manage the workforce, it doesn't align with the Chinese civil aviation's expectation of how we're managing our workforce.
Yeah.
You know, um, uh, in the West, we use sort of a systems approach to management, where you build a system, you train the people, and then you monitor the system. In a lot of emerging markets, they hold accountability at an individual level, right?
Yeah.
And there's an expectation of reward and punishment at an individual level.
Right.
And if that's not there, it doesn't sort of align with the people's value. I contributed more, I want more, right? And I made a mistake, so there's consequences that the civil aviation might expect in those markets. So
Yeah.
there's a retention part of it, there's a productivity element of it as well, that finding the right balance of local versus international culture.
Yeah. As you mentioned at the beginning, you're joining us from Dubai, so you're physically in the Middle East yourself. So you're obviously very close to what's going on in that region. And yeah, clearly we've seen aviation grow unbelievably in that part of the region, but we've now got Saudi Arabia coming on board, and that is the sort of the elephant in the Middle Eastern room, isn't it? So what's your view of where the Middle East is where that is going, how that's developing and becoming a real hub for global aviation?
I think I think they're obviously they've sort of proven track record or proven business case there of being sort of the hub and spoke, or sort of the transitory location for East and West. Um, Surprising how quick the population here is growing,
Mm.
actually. And when you look at the population here, the the number of people that travel, let's say the flights per population per capita, is extremely high here. Even though the UAE might have a population of 11 million, um, everybody flies.
Yeah. Yeah.
Versus if you go to another place that might be maybe double or triple the size, not everybody flies. So passenger demand is not going to decrease. We're surrounded by huge markets. But from a maintenance standpoint or from an after service standpoint, surprisingly how deficient this region is in terms of support. And we had a meeting when we first established here in 2023 with one of the largest operators, and they were crying out for local support.
Yeah.
They plan to operate their aircraft for longer. They don't expect to have the same kind of OEM relationships or OEM support on some of their aircraft fleets, and that means that they need a faster supply chain.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
when you look at this market, outside of OEMs, you don't see third-party maintenance organizations, right? And so we see a tremendous opportunity to fill that gap.
Yeah. Is this fixing the supply chain? And that encompasses a lot of things potentially, but it just seems to be the supply chain issues, which we think are probably going to be with us forever now. This isn't a just a post-COVID thing or a blip. It's just a very difficult situation to be in, and there's long-term issues, but there's technology now that is developing to help with this. Do you think that fixing supply chain is the key for the aviation industry going forward? In order to really exploit the clear customer demand that's there and is only growing.
I think aviation. I don't think there's any fixing supply chain, simply because the aviation industry, in terms of product, number of aircraft flying,
Yeah.
number of aircraft delivered, is not a mass production type of environment. And when there's an issue, there might be only one unit available in the whole world to solve that specific operator's problem. So supply chain is, in the aviation world, is just about risk management, right?
Yeah.
It's about how to balance that risk of component failure versus the cost of having too much stuff on their shelf.
Yeah.
And so I think that to your point, and it's kind of a continuation of the COVID strategy, aviation has been very much centralized, right? It's been centralized in the United States, or centralized in Europe. And I think from a tax perspective, from a manpower availability perspective, from a cost perspective, there's a stronger and stronger argument of having more diversification in maintenance support, than having everything so centralized in Europe and the United States.
Yeah. One of the areas, and I know you said at the beginning you're into this area, is in terms of part supply, is tear down and recycling, which we know a number of companies who do that around the world. Is that as efficient as it can be? Could there be a better way of making sure that available parts are made available or put back into the market?
That's a very interesting question, and I think to short answer, absolutely not efficient. There's ways of getting it much more efficient. Today, if you look at tearing down an aircraft in, let's say, outside of the West, you're going to face customs issues where some of these markets are a little bit less mature in how do they handle an aircraft that was imported as an aircraft and that gets exported as parts.
Yeah.
Right. From a custom standpoint, there's sort of a matching principle that just gets completely broken, and the implications of that are just massive taxes or massive delays or potential corruption, right? Because it sort of then leads to all that. So there is regulatory changes that need to happen in a lot of markets that would then benefit from being able to tear down their own aircraft and keep them in country. The second element of that is then also the reservicing or tagging of those parts, right? If you look at, for example, China, there's a lot of components a lot of aircraft that have been torn down, but the market for those aircraft, those components is international, is not China. And so there are warehouses filled with available, USM.
Yeah.
I guess that you can leave out the S because it's not serviceable, and they don't have the supply chain in that market to make it serviceable to then be able to sell it internationally. So from a maintenance capacity standpoint, if you tear it down in, let's say, Indonesia, you're still sending parts all over the world for retagging versus being able to do that locally. And again, if you're tearing it down in Indonesia, then you have a whole host of customs issues.
Yeah, sounds like one of those complex issues that will never be really fixed because of the complexity and the regulatory issues that are involved.
I think that there is a receptiveness in the emerging markets to change, and if it's not necessarily even change, maybe it's just trailblazing, right? In the sense that somebody cracks the code. It's like, okay, well, this is how you do it, because it's not that these emerging markets are against solving the problem, right?
Yeah.
It's just that sometimes they're facing it for the first time, and hopefully it becomes more common so that people then look at it and say, oh yeah, we know what that is, this is how we'll handle it. And that's starting to happen.
One of the other things that technology can do particularly is to increase efficiency and have parts available sort of on demand. We're particularly interested in this area because we run the predictive aircraft maintenance conferences, which will happen in Dubai and Singapore this year. So we see some of the potential for technology to do some quite incredible things there. Sometimes it's in its early phase, and AI is now coming in with huge promise. Are you confident that emerging tech like that can assist with some of these issues that we're facing?
Early on in my career, I was a strategy consultant with Oliver Wyman.
Yeah.
And it was post 9/11. We worked at one of the large legacy airlines in the United States, and my job was to crunch all this data to then be able to pull out some really, valuable reports to make management decisions. I won't get into too much of the data details. In some of these large airlines, they actually have a mountain of data, a tremendous amount of data, but these systems still struggle to communicate with each other. And predictive maintenance is just feeding more data into organizations that actually probably today already have enough data to be able to crunch it and to come up with actionable decision making. So the challenge I see with predictive maintenance is not so much the ability to predict it. It's more about how to connect and digest all this data, and ideally you're doing it across organizations and not just within an organization. Because to do predictive maintenance, you need to not only look at the usage side or the reliability on wing, but you need to look at also the maintenance side of it and sort of connect all these pieces together to say, okay, well, it's a predicted failure, but what's the predicted lead time for getting that thing serviceable to impact your inventory levels, some of these things that actually can impact the bottom line or your cash flow.
Yeah. I mean, much of the discussion at the PAM conference is all about, well, collaboration. The word collaboration is used probably more than any other word because there's a lack of it, but there's a real need for it. And it talks to what you said. If you're not working together, in the end of the day, it is a single industry, although everyone competes, but also they also cooperate as well. So it's a big challenge, but you do see potentially obviously technology always promises great efficiency savings. Whether that ever is actually realized is another issue. But I guess with your background at Oliver Wyman, you'll know all about this. Just before we finish, tell us a bit about yourself. You've obviously been in the industry a fair amount of time. You're very experienced. You mentioned Oliver Wyman was in your background. What brought you to the stage personally?
So early on I've been in aviation for almost 25 years. And I joined aviation at a very interesting time just after 9/11.
Right.
And I was based in the US. And I got to sort of jump into the fire where the operators were sort of collapsing like dominoes in terms of going into restructuring and bankruptcy, and really having to take a hard look at some of these operators' legacy maintenance organizations that were built, I think, largely out of necessity, right? When you wanted to build an airline, you'd sort of look around the landscape and there wasn't support. So in order to fly that airline, you needed to build the maintenance and you needed to build the hangars and you needed to build all this structure in order to just operate your business. Post 9/11, the operators had an opportunity to sort of look around and say, well, there is a landscape now that can support us. Do we still need to do it all ourselves? And that was where I entered the industry.
Yeah.
And in 2002, we took some difficult decisions with closing down some maintenance facilities in the United States. And at the time, one of the largest clients I was working with decided to outsource their wide-body maintenance to China. And I was directly involved with that financial analysis. And it was such a strong, convincing financial savings. Ultimately, it actually made it free. Their maintenance for their C-checks, for their wide bodies became free because it wasn't just about a third-party organization doing it cheaper. The third-party organization was able to do it faster. And so they were able to restructure their fleet plan, return one aircraft, a 777, and the savings from the 777 lease paid for their C-checks.
Right. Okay.
And, in an industry, to your point, that the equipment moves, the equipment flies. I'm very much was raised as a capitalist to say, well, if an aircraft can fly, then it should always be maintained in a place that makes the most economic sense.
Yeah.
And that's sort of how I've driven my career and still continue to do so, where today I see places beyond China that offer the same or better economic story to operators to help them continue to offer their products profitably to the industry.
Yeah. Look, our time's nearly up, but before we finish, just a sort of a broad question to finish on. Given your experience, you've seen the industry go through lots of crises, obviously not least the most recent one with COVID. Where do you think we are as an industry in as aviation in terms of its growth and its development and its maturity? You listen to what IATA and Willie Walsh talks about, and always talks about the industry isn't profitable enough. Huge amounts of capital outlay for not enough return for the operators. Are we moving to a point where that is being addressed and changing, or is it always going to be the same? Is aviation always going to be a kind of a high risk but high reward industry, and it will go through sort of peaks and troughs?
I'd like to hope that there is some bright future. We with our facilities in South America, obviously we're supporting airlines in the market, and a simple comment or an unexpected tariff war or an expulsion of undocumented illegal aliens from the United States spurs, a trade conflict with the country. And all of a sudden myself waking up in Dubai saying, oh, well, now flights are banned between two countries for some completely random reason that then ultimately affects our ability to support them and maintain their aircraft. So, we're in a very, very sensitive industry. I can't see that changing anytime soon. I do like a little bit of what China has tried to do with some of their regulations, where they put a minimum fare for flight tickets.
Okay.
And they did that based on the assumption that a ticket needs to be sold at a certain basic price to maintain safety of that aircraft. And other countries have gone the opposite way, where they've put a ceiling or a max price for what a ticket can be sold for to prevent, consumer gouging or whatever the case might be. And I would like to see more countries take that approach, where it's just like, let's maintain a healthy and safe environment, rather than airlines becoming too competitive in terms of price that ultimately not only affects the stability of the industry, but potentially affects the safety of the aircraft as well.
Yeah. I guess what you're saying about, there's always something around the corner. It's usually some sort of eruption. It could be an actual eruption or some sort of political eruption, as we're seeing at the minute. But in some ways, as a capitalist, as you mentioned, that excitement maybe is what gets you out of bed in the morning. If it was the same every day, maybe you wouldn't be quite as keen to be in this industry and set up a new business. So, is that one of the things that sort of secretly drives you on as well, personally?
It's funny because, when you're on the service side of it, right, maintenance side of it, or part side of it, sometimes it feels a little bit like a fruits and vegetable market.
Right.
where parts are flowing like somebody buying vegetables. It's like, oh, somebody needs something urgently, an aircraft's grounded somewhere, somebody's got a product somewhere else in the world, and so I guess that part of it definitely is exciting. Being on the sort of the ownership side of it, I'm not sure the roller coasters excite me as much as they used to.
Yeah, it's very much like a trader's market almost, isn't it? But in a very sort of high-end technical way. Our time is done, but it's been great to speak to you for the time we've had. I'm sure we'll speak again in the near future. We'll certainly keep an eye on how DTX does, how it grows now under your ownership, and thanks very much for your time. Thanks, Hussein.
My pleasure, Lee. And yeah, we will be pursuing a couple of acquisitions in the near future here. Some should be concluded within the next 2 months as well. So hopefully we'll have some exciting news to share with you.
Send us the news, and we'll get it out on ABN. So yeah, look forward to hearing about that. Thank you.
Appreciate that.
Cheers.
All right, thanks. Cheers.
Bye.